Good evening and welcome to Tysky Sour. Thank you for tearing yourselves away from the gorgeous sunshine outside to join us this evening. I promise we will make it all worth it for you. Some really big stories tonight. The government, again, have been found to have broken the law, and we have a great guest on that. One of the people who took them to court. Very, very excited for that. And we have some other stories which, whether or not they're significant is up to you. It's more about the furore around them that is telling. I'm talking about the decision of some Oxford students to change a picture on the wall. The initial action doesn't tell us much about the country. The response to it does. We've also got Gareth Southgate and an update on COVID-19. I'm, of course, joined by Dalia. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you, Michael. I've been sunbathing all during my lunch break today, and I just feel immediately so much better. Like the vitamin D has been like absorbed, and my body's missed it. My body has missed it.
I know, it's incredible. Everyone looks amazing. Everyone's smiling. But most importantly, you guys are here watching Tysky Sour. You know the score. If you haven't already, do hit the subscribe button, and you can tweet your comments on the hashtag Tysky Sour. The government have lost their second case in the High Court surrounding contracts issued during the coronavirus pandemic. Back in February, Matt Hancock was found to have acted unlawfully by failing to publish details of contracts for PPE. Today, Michael Gove was found to have broken the law when he granted a contract to the PR firm Public First to test COVID-19 messaging without putting it out to tender. Now, the company directors had close associations with both Gove and Dominic Cummings, and the judge today ruled this meant the granting of the contract gave rise to apparent bias. Now, as in most of these cases, the defense on the part of the government was to say, look, we're in the middle of a pandemic. How could we have been expected to follow usual procedures? There was a pressing priority which overrode really those normal processes. Now, the judge in question, Mrs. Justice O'Farrell, did recognize some of those points in her ruling. She didn't say those arguments were completely ridiculous. Let's go to the relevant part. The fair-minded and informed observer would have appreciated that there was an urgent need for research through focus groups on effective communications in response to the COVID-19 crisis, and that those research services were required immediately. They would have appreciated that it was vital that the results and conclusions from the research were reliable, and that Mr. Cummings was uniquely placed, given his experience and expertise, to form a rapid view on which organisation might best be able to deliver those urgent requirements. His professional and personal connections with Public First did not preclude him from making an impartial assessment in this regard. So she's saying, to some degree, the government's argument is reasonable. However, the judge ruled that even in these exceptional circumstances, that did not justify only considering one single company to do this job. So Justice O'Farrell said the defendant's failure to consider any other research agency by reference to experience, expertise, availability, or capacity would lead a fair-minded and informed observer to conclude that there was a real possibility or a real danger that the decision maker was biased. Now, that's the basis on which this was ruled to have been a decision made unlawfully. Now, the ruling is specifically against Michael Gove, specifically for the Minister of, as he was and is, Minister for the Cabinet Office. But of course, Dominic Cummings was central to that decision to award these contracts to Public First. They were worth £560,000. Now, Dominic Cummings, now a very active Twitter user, now he's outside of Downing Street, responded to the ruling almost immediately today on Twitter. He said of the ruling, in 2014, I explained how SW1 programs dysfunctional and poor performance. Most big things on COVID were here, including today's issues. Destructive feedback between EU procurement, judicial review, Whitehall management. So we're saying, well, me with all my foresight, I wrote in 2014 how judicial reviews into the procurement process is a problematic thing. It's dysfunctional. I'm not just saying this opportunistically. I wrote it in my blog in 2014. I'm not sure Perhaps he edited it like he did his previous comments on coronavirus, but I can't confirm either way. He goes on. In the judicial review summary, they say there is no suggestion of actual bias, but instead of telling officials to focus on the worst crisis since 1945, a disease which was doubling in 2 to 3 days, I should have told officials to focus on creating a Potemkin paper trail to negate campaigners claiming appearance of bias. Now, he goes on to say that if he'd focused on the paperwork instead of making immediate decisions, he would have allowed more people to die. He also suggests that this judgment will lead to worse decision-making in the future. So he says, the court is telling SW1, so that's Westminster, even in a crisis like a once-a-century pandemic, your real focus should always be the paper trail. There is already a huge destructive problem, and today's judgment will make it even worse. If COVID doesn't justify focus on outcomes over process, nothing will. He's making a very clear defense of his actions. He's saying that the court's judgment will just mean the bureaucrats, civil servants, and politicians are more interested in making a paper trail and doing paperwork than in saving lives. Is that a good argument? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Jolyon Maugham, founder of the Good Law Project, which brought the case against Michael Gove.
Well, it certainly should lead to more accountable government, shouldn't it? I mean, in any normal country, in any functioning, mature democracy, you would expect a finding by a high court that a particular contract was awarded, it would appear to a neutral observer through reasons of favoritism, to mean that heads roll. But unfortunately, as your viewers, listeners will know, we are no longer a sort of normal functioning democracy. Will it lead to more paperwork? I don't think the answer to that is necessarily yes, but I suppose I attack really the premise of the question. What Dominic Cummings is saying in those tweets essentially is, look, this is public money, not my money, but nevertheless, you can leave it to me to make the right decisions. You can trust me not to give contracts to my friends. You can trust me not to give contracts to people who, for example, I think might do party political work on the public dime. And I have a problem with that predicate. So I don't think one gets to Dominic's question. It's not really a balance between speed and paperwork. This is public money, and he needs to explain, Michael Gove needs to explain to those whose public money it is, taxpayers, why they have spent it in the way in which we have. And that's fundamentally what this case is about.
Do you accept at all the premise that because it was a pandemic, it was a global emergency, some of the usual rules could go out the window? Do you think that if they had followed all the rules, it potentially could have taken longer, but it still would have been worth it because not being as transparent as you'd like is such a grave issue that should override other considerations? Or do you just think this whole issue of counterposing speed and paperwork, or legality, I suppose, is just a misnomer? Do you think that's just a misunderstanding on the part of Cummings?
There is a balance to be struck here. You know, if you're sophisticated and thoughtful about these things, what you do is you look at the fact pattern and you try and behave in a responsible way, having regard to it. So it's not good enough just to go and buy whatever you want because stuff's urgent. And, you know, I mean, there are all sorts of ways of making that point. One is by looking at the £350 million of money that we spent on PPE through placing contracts with PESFIX, which is in the VIP lane. I mean, we got very little. It's not even clear we got any usable PPE. So, you know, there is always a need, there is always a value to process. And I think I would also say the pandemic justifies short-circuiting process so far as is necessary to short-circuit process in order to achieve the result that the demands of the pandemic dictates. It doesn't mean you can throw the baby out with the bathwater. It doesn't mean you don't have to follow any process at all. And fundamentally, the law is a very sophisticated mechanic through which you interrogate whether those who abandoned elements of process to arrive at outcomes got that balancing exercise so wrong as to be unlawful. Of course, that's not really what this case is about, because in this case, the judge said that no one gave any thought to whether or not someone else could bid for that contract. No one looked at whether there was any time saving through appointing Public First. The judge points out that there were other agencies who were already working for government, rejects government's contention that Public First wouldn't need to be briefed, explains that Public First, in fact, did need to be briefed to carry out this work in the same way as might YouGov have needed to be briefed. So again, it's a superficially attractive argument. It doesn't stand up to analysis, and it doesn't bear examination on the facts. These are intricate, nuanced points, but they are what real life decision making looks like, even in the midst of the pandemic, especially where you are spending public money, and especially where you are spending public money on your friends. And, there's no dispute between Dominic Cummings, Michael Gove on the one hand and me on the other, that Public First were friends of Dominic Cummings and associates of Michael Gove.
Could you explain what it actually means for the High Court to have ruled that Michael Gove and his department have acted unlawfully? Because lots of people hear this as he's acted unlawfully. Why isn't he going to jail? Why isn't he subject to criminal sanction? So could you, law for beginners, I suppose, explain the implications when a government department is found guilty of having acted unlawfully?
If you're running a public law case on the grounds of bias, you tend to ask the question whether there is apparent bias. In other words, would a reasonable observer think that the contract was awarded through favoritism? Because if you show apparent bias, that leads to a finding that the contract was unlawful. If you're arguing in a different context, if you're trying to bring a criminal prosecution for example, misconduct in public office, you would have to show that there is actual bias. We brought a public law case. One of the reasons we brought a public law case is because as members of sort of civil society rather than the police force, we don't have the power to compel the production of evidence by Dominic Cummings, by Michael Gove, by Number 10, because there's evidence too that Number 10 was pushing for contracts to go to Public First and Anbury. And because we can't compel the production of evidence, it's very difficult for us to get over the very high hurdle of proving actual bias, proving misconduct in public office, which you have to prove sort of beyond reasonable doubt if you want to prove a criminal if you want to prove that there's been a criminal offence committed. So no one goes to prison in consequence of this decision. There should, as I've already explained, be consequences. The effect is to expose yet another cabinet minister to have acted unlawfully in handling pandemic procurement. Gebrial Project has a whole slate of cases. It should cause political embarrassment to government. It does make government look like what it is in the public sphere, which is irresponsible and law-breaking. But those are fundamentally political rather than legal costs attached to this decision.
Jolyon Maugham, the founder of the Good Law Project. Dalia, this is the second time we've been in this situation. The government have been found to have acted unlawfully in the High Court. They seem fairly confident, that they can just brush these rulings off. They can say, look, it was a pandemic, who cares what was legal and what wasn't. Of course, this is also not going to be the last time this happens. The Good Law Project have a bunch of other cases in the pipeline. Do you think this is going to start to cause problems for the government, or not? I suppose in a way, I really obviously respect what Jolyon Maugham is doing here, but many of the people who were very aggravated by this particular issue were also aggravated, about Brexit, a second referendum, political projects that kind of went nowhere. Do you think this one is different?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, right? It depends if, there are movements and an opposition that are going to make good on this. But, I mean, the reason that the Tories can brush it off, that the government can brush it off, is because, unfortunately, they hold immense power over the institutions that make up the state, right? Formally and informally. So from, having this massive majority in the Commons to, very inappropriate proximity to establishment media to, even I would argue being able to actually govern the talking points in the remit of the opposition, unfortunately. This is a government that has been defined by its impunity. It's the character of Boris Johnson, is that sense of, impunity, of buffoonishness, of incompetence, masked as kind of, sort of wrapped up in this jingoistic, old school form of public school colonial governor style, reputation. And the courts are probably one of the very few institutions that have, albeit in quite a mealy-mouthed way, occasionally held the government to account, but often it's not done with that much enforcement. But I think that Cummings is very smart to turn this into a anti-bureaucracy point, because, there's certainly a point to be made that, bureaucratization doesn't always mean accountability. And it also, kind of appeals to how much people hate bureaucracy in their own workplaces and how much they feel like it stops them from, getting on with what they need to do. But that's all a distraction from the fact of what's going on here, which is that the government has used this pandemic to enrich their financial allies in a way that has cost a significant number of lives, I would argue. And, the reason that we have such high rates of deaths per capita, which, I would argue is the highest of the countries that have kind of comparable economies to the UK, it's not because of paperwork. It's because of bad decision-making and bad messaging. It's the dithering. It's the locking down too late. It's the not making use of lockdowns to build proper infrastructure. It's, the long trend of defunding the NHS and redirecting resources away from patients and healthcare providers and towards sort of busybodying middle managers. It's the lack of provisions for precarious workers to actually self-isolate if they need to self-isolate. It's, and it's not only that, but it's the issues that actually come directly out of this very problem, this culture of impunity and corruption that lies at the heart of how this pandemic has been managed. And that falls at the feet of the government, and particularly at the feet of Cummings. And a big part of that is, and why this court case is so relevant and why it's so sneaky for Cummings to kind of turn this into an anti-bureaucracy point, is that it's specifically the doling out of essential contracts to private companies that do not have the record or the demonstrated ability to carry out these essential functions in the middle of a health crisis, whether that's providing free school meals or building a test and trace system. And, so the problem isn't just the outsourcing of, essential functions that should be provided by the public sector to private companies who, because of the logic of what a private company is, they will scrimp on resources, scrimp on what they actually provide for people and pocket the rest, as we saw with the school lunches fiasco. But it's even if we're going to outsource these functions, even if for whatever reason you win the argument on outsourcing, which I don't think is possible, you at least have to outsource to companies that, not just companies that you happen to have close connections to, but companies that actually have some evidence that they can carry out the project that you're outsourcing to them. And this is essentially a problem of the government. It's not a problem of bureaucracy. It's not a problem of urgency. It's a problem of the government looking at this pandemic, using that sense of emergency and urgency that it creates, and seeing dollar signs, or pound signs, I guess, for them and their mates. And that is and it's also not only this momentary enrichment, but it's also them trying to use this as an opportunity to normalize the idea that essential services, especially those in social and healthcare, would be more efficient if they were outsourced. It's to normalize the idea of outsourcing to private companies these kinds of services that have traditionally been held by the state and held by the public sector. But unfortunately for the government, the only thing that's worked in this entire pandemic, the only thing that has saved not only the government's ass, but our ass as well, is the vaccination program, which was led by the public sector. It was led by the NHS. So Cummings turning this into some kind of, anti-bureaucratic, we were putting people before paperwork kind of thing. It's a smart move, but it's a lie, as a lot of what comes out of this government is. And we need to hit back at that by emphasizing that the public sector knows how to get stuff done with people in mind, and that all the private sector knows how to do is hoard resources for its shareholders and its owners at the expense of everyone else. And that's the main lesson from this pandemic, not this issue of, paperwork or bureaucracy, as much as Cummings is trying to make it about that.
No, I mean, I definitely agree with your take on the level of integrity Cummings has. I suppose the vaccines, what the government will argue is that, yes, the NHS rollout was fantastic, as was the NHS reorganizing itself throughout the pandemic. But the procurement of the vaccines was by its vaccine task force, which was led by a investment banker. So that's going to be their argument. I don't think that rights all the wrongs of signing all of these contracts with their friends. Now, Shailendra Singh with a fiver says, what are the chances that the Daily Mail will headline tomorrow's edition with "Crush the Law-Breaking Lawmakers"? It's a good headline. I think the chances are 1%, because, the Daily Mail would take the other angle on this. The Daily Mail are always having a go at judges and saying, oh, we want the executive to have unrestrained power for some reason. I suppose they think because the executive likes the Daily Mail, then giving them unrestrained power would be a good thing to do. They've got their pal in the top. Why have the rest of the system restrain what they can and cannot do? So I would expect the Daily Mail to take the opposite take. I could be wrong. If you haven't already, do remember to hit that like button if you're enjoying tonight's stream. Our next story is about the current situation with COVID-19. Now, the rise in COVID cases caused by the Delta variant, that's the variant first identified in India, means Britain now has the highest levels of COVID seen since February. As you can see from the government dashboard, there were 7,540 cases identified in the past 24 hours, pushing the 7-day average 66% higher than the previous week. Now, while that increase on the graph might look small compared to the January peak, we know how dramatically things can change when growth is exponential. So what can look like a little rise can actually be the start of what becomes an essentially very, very steep rise. That's how exponential growth works. We should be used to by now the damaging effects that can have. Now, of course, what has been unclear up to this point is whether or not this rise in cases will lead to an increase in hospitalizations. Now, the hope here has been that because the vast majority of the people who are vulnerable to serious disease with COVID-19 have been vaccinated, therefore, we might have broken the link between cases and hospitalizations. There's obviously a good logic to that theory. Unfortunately, new reporting from the Financial Times suggests that is only partly the case. So while the vaccinations are stopping some cases translating into hospitalization, there's a significant section of them it is not. Now, these graphs from the FT show hospital admissions by age group in the northwest of England, where the Delta variant is most prevalent. So it's on a log scale. That's why the y-axis says 5, 10, 20, 50, up to 500 instead of being linear, which would be 10, 20, 30. Now, on a log graph, a straight upward line means growth is exponential. And as you can see, among the 18 to 65 age group, there is exponential growth in terms of hospital admissions. So not just in cases, but in admissions. Now, as you can see, so we're looking at the chart on the left. It's less steep than in January, but exponential growth is always very bad. And there are now 150 daily admissions, or around 150 daily admissions of under 65s in the northwest alone. As you can see, the big relief is that in contrast, admissions are flatlining among people over 65. Now, this is all completely consistent with the idea that vaccines will break the chain between infection and hospitalizations. The problem at the moment is not everyone has been vaccinated. And of course, that's especially among the younger groups. That's why we're seeing hospitalizations among the younger groups, but not the older groups. Now, what should we take from all of this? Now, personally, I don't think we need to be alarmist. I think the vaccines seem to be very, very effective. The FT analysis, in fact, suggests that 2 doses of a vaccine are about 95% effective at preventing hospital admissions, even with this Delta variant, and 1 dose is upwards of 70%. So we do have a route out of all of this. The problem is that not everyone's been vaccinated, and I think at times the government are acting a little bit as if they have been, because those 150 daily admissions, it seems to me completely unnecessary, because they are all likely people who, they might have been vaccinated in 3 weeks' time anyway. So if they'd managed to not get infected for another 3 weeks, then they might not have ended up in hospital. And ending up in a hospital, even if you don't die, is really, really, it's a bad thing. Now, that's not to blame these people personally. There are all sorts of reasons why people will get COVID-19. Your kid goes to school. You've gone and ate in a restaurant because the government told you it's fine to eat in a restaurant. These are all completely understandable. But to me, it does seem that, at least in my person, I'm going to be very, very careful socializing indoors. In fact, I'm not going to do it until I've been vaccinated and waited 3 weeks. I'm getting my first vaccine tomorrow, so 3 weeks after that. Some people said you should wait until your second one. If it lowers my chance of serious disease by 70%, it's kind of good enough for me for now. What does frustrate me is the way this is discussed by the government and in the mainstream media, because they still do suggest that the big problem when it comes to should we or should we not remove all restrictions on the 21st of June is whether or not hospitals will be overwhelmed. And that leads to paragraphs like this. This was from an article in the Times today. And it says, there is particular concern about the strain that unvaccinated people in their 30s could place on the health service if there is a surge in cases. While they are less likely to die than older patients, a government source told the Times that many of those admitted with the Indian variant need oxygen and spent at least 2 days in hospital. Now, that seems completely crazy to me. So say, oh, we've got this big rise in people who are, well, the age group there was under 65. I would guess that actually, a lot of them are going to be quite a lot younger than 65, because they're the groups of people who haven't yet been vaccinated. So a lot of relatively young people are going into hospital and potentially ICU. And the problem for the government isn't that young, healthy people are going into ICU. It's that, oh, we might need 2 days worth of oxygen. They'll block some beds for a little while. And it just seems a completely bizarre way of looking at it. The problem with 30-year-olds going into ICU is that, one, that's going to be an incredibly traumatic experience. But two, if you go into ICU with COVID-19, it's not like you get home and you're suddenly fine. This is a serious disease, which if you get it seriously, is going to have quite long-term ramifications for you. So the idea that we only see this as a problem if the hospitals collapse, I just think is a really, really bizarre logic. And it's, from my perspective, why any rush out of the situation we're currently in would be probably mistaken, right? Why not hang outside when the sun is this bright? Why are we so obsessed with opening the nightclubs? And I love nightclubs. Dalia, I want to go to you. How worried are you about this new data we're seeing?
I say this nearly every show, and I'm sure that people are very bored of me saying it. I'm pretty bored of myself, but I don't think that when we're evaluating the overall risk that this virus represents, when we're evaluating, the data on the number of new infections and things like that, I don't think that we should only count hospitalizations because we know that there are many people, many young people who, are the ones out going to work, who are particularly the ones in precarious work where it's much harder to self-isolate if you need to. And are also the ones that are last to be vaccinated. We know that there are many who have been infected. They were never hospitalized, so they won't be counted in that data. But they either have had several months sort of robbed of them through long COVID, or in cases of people I know personally who have chronic conditions as a result of this virus. One of my partner's friends has been diagnosed with diabetes in the aftermath of getting, a young, early 20s kid, who now has a lifelong condition as a result of this. And that's why, I think that the opening of indoor spaces was just before we had, you know, especially like a lot of young people vaccinated. I mean, it was just a purely profit move, right? It's like we could feasibly all have, you know, the weather's nice. We could all feasibly eat outside, drink outside, enjoy public, you know, park spaces, do picnics and things like that. So we can still socialize and we can still get, you know, get that socializing that we haven't had for so long. Without actually opening up indoor spaces. The only reason behind that is because, you know, bars and businesses make a lot more money when indoor spaces open up, because it's more clients, more customers that you can have at any one time. But that doesn't actually fulfill a social need necessarily. And it actually, you know, creates a level of risk that is just not really that necessary, given that, you know, the weather's nice enough for us to be outside, and we know that it's very unlikely you're very unlikely to transmit the virus if you are outside. But, you know, so that's why I'm personally avoiding indoor spaces for sure, especially because I haven't been vaccinated yet, because I'm just so young. But it also makes me worry about, you know, this kind of vaccines are the silver bullet approach and messaging that this government has really pushed to basically cover up for the fact that they've been so bad at actually managing the crisis before we had the vaccines. But the reason that it worries me is because it means that it's much harder to generate compliance with, you know, not necessarily another lockdown, but delays in easing particular parts of the lockdown, or having to, you know, renege on certain parts of the easing of the lockdown. Even if it turns out that we need it now or in the future. And it also means that it sends me the message that we still haven't built the infrastructure to protect us from having to have any more debilitating lockdowns should either another pandemic come along, or if some kind of variant means that the vaccines aren't as effective. So I think that this kind of like the fact that even though the data is a bit worrying, and that, you know, for a lot of epidemiologists, they're saying, you know, we really need to revisit that 21st of June mark, it seems almost impossible for that to happen, because such a narrative has been built up that, you know, on the 21st of June, we'll all be free. It's all over now that we have the vaccines. That has been so pushed by the government because it creates this kind of superhero narrative, as if like, oh my God, like he fixed it, it's all done. But actually it could have those long-term public health consequences, and it's just not necessary. We're so nearly there.
We are so nearly there. I mean, it might be overstated to the extent to which vaccines are a silver bullet, but I mean, in a way, they're fucking cool. Like when we're all vaccinated, so many of these problems are going to really slide away, which is why I think it just seems unnecessary to be having 30-year-olds going into hospital when in literally like 3 weeks' time, they'll all be vaccinated. But anyway, we'll get there soon, and the sun is out. So I actually don't think this choice is as sort of hard and grim as previous ones have been. Let's go on to our next story. Less consequential, but more entertaining. The Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has spent most of the past year twiddling his thumbs. When schools closed in January, it became apparent he'd done virtually nothing since the start of the pandemic to aid home learning. Kids still didn't have laptops after months. It was his job. He didn't do it. He was also silent when Rishi Sunak spiked a plan by the Education Czar to invest billions in catch-up programs. Right? This is an Education Secretary who doesn't really like to do his job. However, this week, Williamson finally found a voice, finally found an issue which was worth him pricking up his ears and paying attention. And that was to express his outrage that a group of students decided to replace a picture of the Queen in their common room. Now, the story was revealed by the right-wing blog Guido Fawkes. Now, they report a committee of students from Magdalen's middle common room agreed by a substantial majority to take the portrait of Queen Elizabeth down from their wall and to explore replacing the portrait with art by or of other influential and inspirational people. Guido Fawkes, who had been sent the minutes of the meeting, presumably by a right-wing student, brought out some of the comments or reproduced some of the comments that were made in the discussion. So they report, one student claimed that patriotism and colonialism are not really separable. Another claimed the move was not about cancelling the Queen, saying the committee was not capable of doing so. This is about our communal space and making people feel welcome. Now, I'd have thought, I think that Guido were trying to pull out, the most outrageous quotes there. They all actually sound very, very reasonable to me. Of course, patriotism and colonialism are not really separable. That doesn't mean we necessarily have to throw patriotism out the window, but we can't pretend there is no relationship between those two things. And this wasn't cancelling the Queen. More importantly than this, a middle common room, it's a student union for people of a particular college who are master's students, essentially. Like, it's going to be a few dozen people, like 100 or so people. They've decided that they want to change the picture on their wall. This is kind of, I can imagine it's above a pool table or something. Really, really not a significant decision. But Guido thinks it's a story. And Gavin Williamson thinks it's a story, because in response to this article from Guido Fawkes, Gavin Williamson tweeted the following: Oxford University students removing a picture of the Queen is simply absurd. She is the head of state and a symbol of what is best about the UK. During her long reign, she has worked tirelessly to promote British values of tolerance, inclusivity, and respect around the world. Now, on a factual level, I mean, she was the head of the British Empire. I'm not really sure if the values of tolerance, inclusivity, and respect for everyone around the world were, the values she represented. We also know that within the time span of her reign, the royal family, the House of Windsor, had a policy of not employing anyone from an ethnic minority. So she's not necessarily the image of inclusivity that many people in the British establishment want to paint her as. But more importantly than that, this doesn't matter. This is not something that an education secretary should be commenting on. This is students deciding to replace one picture with another picture. It's like, if I take down a picture of Prince and replace it with a picture of Dua Lipa in my bedroom, I am not cancelling Prince. I am changing the picture. Here, they are not cancelling the Queen. They are changing a picture. Dalia, I mean, what do you make of this? Like, it's so... I'm going to say bizarre, but it's actually predictable, so it's not bizarre. It's just embarrassing that we have an education secretary who comments on this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, deja vu. Talk about deja vu. I feel like I'm called in to talk about this every bloody 3 weeks. I mean, Gavin Williamson would much rather talk about what's on the wall in a common room in Oxford than, I don't know, the fact that he plunged thousands of young people's future into chaos during the A-level grade saga when, he decided to allow an algorithm that discriminated against people based on their, where they live and what their class is, to decide student grades. Or the fact that, he's repeatedly tried to force teachers and students back into unsafe working environments without the proper precautions, and only, doing last minute U-turns when the trade unions get involved. Or, the abysmal decision to revoke free school meals and summer holidays in the middle of a pandemic. Or, the fact that even things like the laptop scheme, which is so vital for so many kids in the middle of a pandemic where so many people are having to rely on remote learning, the fact that that hasn't been rolled out nearly to the scale that was either promised or that is needed. Or he doesn't want to talk about the fact that, 92% of 6,000 teachers that were polled said that he should resign. So he doesn't have any confidence in the workers that are in the sector that he's responsible for. He would much rather talk about this than be challenged on any of those issues. So it's not surprising to me that, he's coming out guns blazing, because this is essentially a cheap shot to galvanize a base at the expense of a group of maybe a few dozen students who don't have the means to defend themselves against the weight of an abusive tabloid media, which is, the full weight of which we are currently seeing, and their own Secretary of Education essentially inciting a hate campaign against them. This isn't a story. A tiny group of students have democratically decided what they want to do with their communal space. That is something they are perfectly entitled to do. Is that not the basis of free speech and debate and democracy? These students had a debate, they had a discussion, they made a democratic decision. And what is essentially happening here is that the Secretary of Education is trying to punish students for taking down a picture of the head of state from their common room. Is that the mark of a democratic and a free society? who's the snowflake here? Like, is that the mark of British values that are apparently so uniquely British and yet seem to be violated by the British state on a regular basis? And this tells me that, you know, this whole free speech moral panic where, you know, the biggest threats to free speech are like, you know, students and like Black people and trans people, you know, it's a complete Trojan horse for forcing people to accept and promote reactionary and bigoted views, because the actual consensus for such views is shrinking. So they need to resort to whatever they can, especially these cheap tactics, to ensure that these positions and views still have to be represented in the mainstream, even though actually amongst the younger generation, the future generations, it doesn't hold that much cachet. And I think when it comes to how we should respond to this, it's really easy to kind of brush this off as like a silly distraction. And to an extent it is, you know, it's not like the most deep or serious thing, but it also, you know, it clearly isn't just that. It's like what we are seeing here is a petty but very vicious backlash to the fact that there is undoubtedly, you know, particularly, as I said, amongst young people, a growing radical, anti-racist, anti-colonial consciousness that isn't just accepting, you know, mere representation. It's not saying that, oh, if you just represent us or diversify a bit, then we'll shut up. But it's actually rooting their understanding of anti-racism and anti-colonialism in systemic change of our economic and political systems. They are identifying the role that the British state, which includes the monarchy, you know, I think there's a lot of thinking, you know, misinformed thinking that the monarchy just has symbolic power. No, they are like the British royal family is like one of the biggest landowners in the world. Like land is not a symbolic form of power. It's actually a very material form of power that is enforced with a lot of violence. But it's essentially a backlash against that changing anti-racist consciousness, because I am sure that the establishment media and the government were very shaken at those scenes last summer. Not only that young Black and brown people were taking to the streets and demanding different kinds of change, but also that young white kids and, you know, even older white people in rural areas, parts where we don't normally see, you know, big turnout for anti-racist demonstrations, we even saw it there. And so instead of actually reckoning with that, they are basically just kind of picking fights with groups of people who can't defend themselves and caricaturing the people who are pushing for change. And they're enforcing top-down legislation to stop the conversation. And that's what we see in the measures to ban the use of anti-capitalist materials as teaching materials. And that's why, as silly as it might seem, we have to defend these students, because first of all, this is a deliberate attempt here to basically spark a hate campaign that they don't deserve. I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that. It's incredibly destroying. It's incredibly destructive. I know many people who are still picking up the pieces of the mental health impacts of being the subject of a hate campaign led by the government and led by tabloid media. But this is also how the right is trying to galvanize power in the face of shifting terrain, using these cheap tabloid style tactics. It's an attempt to delegitimize, using the full power of the state and the media, those who are pushing to change things. And we mustn't dismiss these students. We have to defend them, because it's important that that delegitimization strategy, for all of our sakes, is not successful. And that at a time when so many powerful forces are trying to demonize them, we need to show that there is a large mass of us that are willing to back them up.
That was incredibly well put. Now, if you want to hear more analysis like that from Dalia on the stories we cover every Wednesday, do make sure you subscribe to the channel. Of course, we put out videos every week with all of our fantastic contributors. Now, I'm going to look at a few more responses to this story. So there was a good statement actually from the president of Magdalen College. That's, you know, the employee who's most powerful in the college. Now, in response to the story, she said, "Here are some facts about Magdalen College and Her Majesty the Queen. The Middle Common Room is an organisation of graduate students. They don't represent the college. A few years ago, in about 2013, they brought a print of a photo with the Queen to decorate their common room. They recently voted to take it down. Both of these decisions are their own to take, not the college's. Magdalen strongly supports free speech and political debate and the MCR's right to autonomy. Maybe they'll vote to put it up again. Maybe they won't. Meanwhile, the photo will be safely stored. Being a student is about more than studying. It's about exploring and debating ideas. It's sometimes about provoking older generations. Looks like that isn't so hard to do these days. So if you are one of the people currently sending obscene and threatening messages to the college staff, you might consider pausing and ask yourself whether that is really the best way to show your respect for the Queen, or whether she'd be more likely to support the traditions of free debate and democratic decision-making that we are keeping alive at Magdalen. Now, I'm not necessarily sure if she could say, oh, the Queen is massively committed to democratic decision-making. She is, of course, a hereditary monarch and was the head of the British Empire. But in any case, the overall point, the defense of the students is pretty good there. I thought that was a reasonable statement that gave some important context to this story. And one thing she definitely is right about is how easy it now is to provoke the older generation. Now, the decision by a few students to change a picture didn't just provoke a response from Williamson, it also got a whole front page in the Daily Mail. So they thought this was the most important story of the previous 24 hours. Outrageous Oxford students vote to axe Queen. It's important to note they didn't vote to axe the Queen. You know, that would be, you know, they voted to abolish the Queen, or, you know, something much more significant that will change the picture above the pool table or next to the coffee machine to a different picture that people in our student body associate more with. I mean, it's completely sensationalist clickbait headline. I want to go now to someone who probably should have known better. Andy Burnham was asked about this on LBC, and I thought his answer was really goddamn embarrassing. He's being interviewed by Nick Ferrari. Let's take a look.
Noting that your great city has some tremendous universities, and you yourself went to the other place, a word on Oxford University students deciding to take down a portrait of the Queen because it makes them feel uncomfortable.
Well, God, I can't really relate to that if I'm honest. You know, I think these kind of gestures are getting a bit out of hand. If I'm honest, Nick, I mean, I don't support that. You know, we are all, I think, always should respect the Queen,
Indeed.
but particularly now, given things that have happened in the last few months. So no, I don't support that. You know, let's get a sense of proportion and a bit of respect back. People can air their views, but those kind of gestures, I think, are divisive. Actually, they just divide people, and I don't think they achieve much, to be honest.
Well said, Andy.
Come on. Like, for a start, that's a lie. He says, I can't really relate to this. Now, you were in university as a socialist, right? I'm sure the idea that you didn't want the Queen above your coffee machine or your pool table, you might not agree. You can definitely relate to that. Come on, this is not a complex point. You know, it's not alien. You must know some Republicans in your life, even if you're not one. I mean, probably he is one. Come on, let's face it, right? But he won't admit it because he wants to be leader of the Labour Party and ultimately the Prime Minister. So he's got to keep up this pretense that he's really supportive of the Queen. The most ridiculous part of that answer, though, was Andy Burnham saying, let's get a sense of proportion. Now, he is a senior Labour politician, Mayor of Manchester, and he is telling Nick Ferrari that he condemns people changing a picture in their common room for a different picture. And he's saying it's other people who don't have a sense of proportion. Give me a break. You know, Andy Burnham has had a good run, right? He's had a good run over the past few weeks. He's made some decent arguments, made some good stands against the government. But going on national radio and telling students they need to get a sense of proportion for changing one poster to another poster, it's completely bizarre. Now, you might say, look, the question posed by Nick Ferrari, maybe Andy Burnham didn't quite get how insignificant this was. I presume he did. I mean, this was huge on last night's news. So that was this morning. This story broke last night. And also, there's no harm in an interview in saying, so, Nick, you're saying they voted to take down a picture. Where was the picture? You know, you can say, look, I would have left the picture up, but I'm not going to condemn a bunch of students for changing a poster. It's frankly very, very embarrassing. Dalia, what did you make of that answer from Andy Burnham? I don't think, thankfully, we've had a statement from Keir Starmer yet, because I'm sure it wouldn't be particularly insightful or pleasing. But that was quite, like, Andy Burnham's trying to put himself forward as sort of like, I'm the reasonable leader guy who could actually challenge the establishment, and I'm not just going to grovel on my knees to try and make royalists think that I'll do everything they possibly ask. Do you think that was damaging to him?
I mean, it's cowardice. It's cowardice, it's pandering, it's the easy way out. And I think that he needs to really think about what his pathway to power is, and think about the role that people who have experienced the brute force, of, you know, the state, particularly during empire, the role that those people are going to play in his pathway to power, and maybe should reflect a little bit on what he owes them. This would have been such an easy conversation. All he needed to do was say, look, I'm not here to talk about what a few dozen students do with their decor in their university common room. I'm here to talk about XYZ things. But instead, what he's doing, and I have to bring this back to my own personal experience of being a student and having the full weight, like, I cannot explain to you what it must feel like for those students to see that front page of the Daily Mail saying that they have voted to axe the Queen. Like, that is incredibly inflammatory, disgusting language. And I dread to think what those students' email boxes, what their, you know, their, I don't know what it is they have in Oxford, like their pigeonholes. I dread to think what is in those things right now. And Andy Burnham has added to that pile-on with Nick Ferrari. So, you know, whose side are you on? It's disgusting. It's pandering. It's cowardice. It's unimaginative. And it just tells me that he doesn't really have the tools to deal with the terrain that a lot of these issues are being fought on. And I go back to the thing that I said about how, you know, in many ways it seems silly, and and it is silly in many ways, but underpinning it is a very serious difference in ideology and a very serious intergenerational shift that is happening. And I don't think Andy Burnham wants to be on the wrong side of it. And I think even if he wanted to stay neutral, or even if he wanted to kind of, you know, distance himself from it, there was a very easy way to do that. You know, Andy Burnham knows how to deflect. I'm sure he's had his media training, and he actively chose to join in what must be an incredibly terrifying moment for a few students who should feel able to participate in the democratic processes of their university without feeling that they might be exposed by the Daily Mail, by Guido Fawkes, by their own government, to what is essentially the inciting of what is likely to be a lot of harassment and a lot of violence. And I think, not physical violence, hopefully, but sort of, you know, whatever, you know what I mean. But I also think that that's where it's important to note here that the, you know, whilst I think you rightly point out the issues with the head of the college's statement, I think the fact that the head of the college came out and defended those students shows us, you know, that we've come a little bit further ahead. Because when we were doing that work in 2015 in around the Roads Must Fall campaign, the chancellor of the university called up a radio station and said that if we don't like it here, we should go to China because we don't value free speech, or, you know, we should go somewhere else if we don't like it here. So, you know, the fact that yeah, I'm not even joking.
I did not know that.
Chris Patterson, who is, by the way, was the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, who was the chancellor of Oxford University, called up a radio station. It was like, if the students don't like it here, they should go somewhere else. So the fact that you know, as problematic as that many problems that statement might have, I'm glad that she actually said that, because I'm sure that will be much more relief to those students than it was back in 2015 when we kind of started this whole fight accidentally.
Well, I did not know that about the Chancellor of Oxford University. That's wild. Let's go to some comments. We've got lots of great comments relevant to this. Caroline Duvier tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. We are sitting at the kitchen table. My Kenyan partner has his head in his hands, shaking at those comments that the Queen has taken her wonderful values around the world. Yeah, his ancestors really felt that when they sterilized the Kikuyu. A very, very important intervention there. Thank you so much for that. Mike John Green with a $5 says, our wedding reception was in the local Masonic lodge, but we insisted that the pics of the Queen and Philip were taken down, and they agreed no problem. Now, there's a lot going on there. This is when I sort of love this to be a phone-in show, because I'm kind of fascinated by the idea of Masonic lodges? Because I've always thought, I suppose from that Simpsons episode, I've always thought, these places should be like secret societies. And it's like, why have they called it the Masonic? Isn't it supposed to be like underground or like in a hidden hut? Anyway, I'd like to know more about that story. Unfortunately, we don't have the phone in sorted yet. Tom Cornford tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. Dalia is exactly right on Tysky Sour. Ridiculous though the story is, we must show solidarity with and support for Oxford students being subjected to a hate campaign by Gavin Williamson and his outriders. The culture war strategy can't just be ignored. It won't go away. I think that's a very, very important comment. And I do think, actually, Dalia, your response was my response to these is often to be a bit more dismissive, but I think you were exactly right actually to say that this is a big deal. The abuse that is now going to be raining down on these people because of headlines like that in the Daily Mail, we do need to take very seriously. Albert Camus tweets on the hashtag Tysky Sour. If being a postgrad student gave me the power to cancel the Queen, I might be tempted to load myself up with the necessary debt. A very good comment to end this segment. If you are enjoying the show, and if you usually enjoy our shows and you have not already become a supporter, please do consider doing so. We ask our viewers for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you're up for that, please do go to novaramedia.com/support if you are already a supporter. Thank you so much. We really, really do appreciate it, and it makes all of this possible. It means that we can continue to expand in the coming weeks and months. Our final story for the evening. When fans booed England players taking the knee last weekend, a new front was opened in Britain's interminable culture wars. But while culture wars often involve tabloids and Tory ministers taking aim at anonymous students, this time the right have picked a stronger opponent, and they might come to regret it. England manager Gareth Southgate on Tuesday released a really brilliant statement defending the right of his players to protest, the right of his players to take symbolic action such as taking the knee at the beginning of matches. In the process, he also put forward a vision of the country and of progressive patriotism that I think will probably be quite scary actually to England's noisy reactionaries. He put forward a very strong argument, which is to say, all of these people who boo people for being anti-racist, that's not acceptable. You're the past, you're going to lose. Now, it's quite a lengthy essay, so I'm just going to take you through some of the key parts, although it is worth reading all of it. Now, in terms of a defense of the right of England players to express opinions and campaign on social issues, Southgate says, our players are role models, and beyond the confines of the pitch, we must recognise the impact they can have on society. We must give them the confidence to stand up for their teammates and the things that matter to them as people. I have never believed that we should just stick to football. I know my voice carries weight, not because of who I am, but because of the position that I hold. At home, I'm below the kids and the dogs in the pecking order, but publicly, I am the England men's football team manager. I have a responsibility to the wider community to use my voice, and so do the players. It's their duty to continue to interact with the public on matters such as equality, inclusivity, and racial injustice, while using the power of their voices to help put debates on the table, raise awareness, and educate. And that statement, I mean, we've talked about Gareth Southgate earlier this week as well. His defense of his players is really, really spot on. It's exactly right. And this claim that they have the right to speak out about their political opinions on social issues, I think is really, really important, because there will be lots of people saying, "Oh, just get on with the football," right? Why should they have a loud voice in politics and social issues? They should just get on with the football and let other people do politics. Now, the problem with that argument is that, well, yeah, footballers, they're very, very wealthy. They're going to be in probably the richest, 1%. Well, they're definitely going to be in the richest, probably 0.1% of people in this country at the moment. But what's important about footballers is that they are one of the few industries which is dominated by people from working class backgrounds, and where there is really strong representation from people from ethnic minorities, right? And so that is why I think they have been coming out with much more progressive positions than people in other industries. So when people say, you should only believe someone when they say footballers shouldn't have a voice, if they also say Tim Martin, the billionaire owner of Wetherspoons, shouldn't have a voice, or if they say Piers Morgan, he's just a private school educated TV star, why should he have political opinions? If people only think that people in these industries which are dominated by posh white men should have opinions, then you should be somewhat suspicious of the ends they are trying to pursue. And that's why Gareth Southgate's defense of footballers speaking out on the issues they care about, I think, is super, super important. Now, another big part of this piece, and what I think was probably equally important, was Gareth Southgate talking about patriotism. Now, this is, it probably goes without saying, but this is key because he is the manager of the England team. So he has actually a big role in shaping what patriotism means. Now, he sort of says personally what it means to him. So he says, for me, personally, my sense of identity and values is closely tied to my family and particularly my granddad. He was a fierce patriot and a proud military man who served during World War II. The idea of representing Queen and country has always been important to me. We do pageantry so well in Britain, and growing up, things like the Queen's Silver Jubilee and royal weddings had an impact on me. He goes on, because of my granddad, I've always had an affinity for the military and service in the name of your country, though the consequence of my failure in representing England will never be as high as his. My granddad's values were instilled in me from a young age, and I couldn't help but think of him when I lined up to sing the national anthem before my first international caps. Now, here he's basically saying, look, my vision of England, what pride means to me, is one that is quite traditional. It's one that is in line with many of the older generations of this country. It's one which is quite likely to be endorsed by the Daily Mail, for example. He's saying, look, this is my patriotism. It's not particularly subversive. But what he does say, which is incredibly important, is that this doesn't have to be everyone's vision of patriotism. And this vision of the country should never be rammed down anyone's throats, right? So on that, he says, for many of that younger generation, your notion of Englishness is quite different from my own. I understand that too. I understand that on this island, we have a desire to protect our values and traditions as we should, but that shouldn't come at the expense of introspection and progress. So he's saying, look, all you people that say, taking the knee at the beginning of a football match, that's anti-English, you're disrespecting our traditions. That's ridiculous. I share a lot of the traditions you're talking about. I mean, this is Gareth. I have a very different idea of the nation to Gareth Southgate, but in the voice of Gareth Southgate, I share lots of the ideas of the nation that you have. But I also understand we have to be incredibly accepting of other notions of what the nation should stand for. Very, very persuasive argument. And finally, from the essay, I want to show you, and what I think is probably most notable, what really stands out, is how Southgate is willing to take a stand and face down bigoted fans who harass his players. So he says there, why would you tag someone in on a conversation that is abusive? Why would you choose to insult somebody for something as ridiculous as the color of their skin? Why? Unfortunately, for those people that engage in that kind of behavior, I have some bad news. You're on the losing side. It's clear to me that we are heading for a much more tolerant and understanding society, and I know our lads will be a big part of that. It might not feel like it at times, but it's true. The awareness around inequality and the discussions on race have gone to a different level in the last 12 months alone. I am confident that young kids of today will grow up baffled by old attitudes and ways of thinking. Now, Dalia, I want to go to you on this. I mean, me and you, we're not the A team when it comes to Novara Media commentary on football, but I think you don't need to know that much about football to understand the significance of this statement from Gareth Southgate. And I mean, we are, I think, really, really lucky to have someone as thoughtful of this who is manager of England, because I think it must mean a lot to those players that they have a football manager who is expressing this, very, very thoughtful defence of them taking a knee at the start of matches, and who actually seems quite committed actually to England being a force for the generation of a new progressive identity in Britain. Well, England, I suppose, as he's manager of England.
Yeah, and I mean, the comparison is in the US, the treatment of players like Colin Kaepernick for, doing a similar gesture before their games, how they have been treated by owners of the NFL. That is kind of a comparison point. I don't know much about Gareth Southgate as a football manager, but I do know that he has the exact gentle dad energy that I really gravitate towards. But I commend, and I think especially coming off the back of the conversation we just had about Andy Burnham, I really commend him for showing up for his players and not being cowed by reactionary dogma. You know, that was a risk. You know, it's not necessarily what his base might want to hear, and he's showing courage where many of our politicians and journalists are really failing in this discussion. And you know, I think someone really needs to write something on why football is becoming, at this particular moment, I know it historically has been at many times, but at this particular moment, it's becoming this kind of key space of like oppositional political sense making, you know, from like the Super League to Marcus Rashford to the dynamics that are playing out here. I think that's very interesting. I'm definitely not the one to write it, but someone should. But I want to bring it back to that conversation again, that language of how the language of snowflakes is just such projection. You know, they call us snowflakes for like wanting to talk about racism or wanting to change the root causes of racism. Yet they're losing their minds because footballers are taking a knee. Like it's hardly a radical example of like anti-racist direct action. It's literally just a gesture of like stop racism in the most like vague and unthreatening terms. But also, you know, that there is this whole dynamic, and I think it's why that kind of compromise that has historically, you know, over the past, you know, decade or two has sort of assuaged a lot of anti-racist mobilization. It's that compromise of representation as a replacement for radical change. And I think it's breaking apart, you know, it's losing cachet with the younger generations. And that's because of this dynamic that many of us have now seen, that when you accept representation as a replacement for, you know, structural change, what you're actually giving into is this idea of shut up and play. You know, you're in the inner circle, whether it's a football team, whether it's, you know, in an organization, in an institution, in a political party, you know, you're in, just shut up and play. We don't want to hear what you have to say, especially when it challenges us or it involves transforming or changing things in any way. And it's the same in these elite universities, like we spoke about earlier. You know, it's this idea of these elite universities will happily use, you know, students of color to pat themselves on the back for diversity, but then they'll punish those same students for actually bringing anti-racist perspectives into the university. And it's a sense of, you know, you can be here, but don't even think about trying to change anything. If you try, we're going to say that you're being inappropriately political, even though this whole damn thing is political. And especially booing players for taking a knee is itself a political act. It's a deeply political act. So I think that, you know, Gareth Southgate saying, you know, whatever my own values are, this idea of saying, particularly to players of color, shut up and play, you know, is wrong. We have to make space for voices, especially marginalized voices. And it's very welcome solidarity from Gareth Southgate. And I think that's the power in it. And the booing that we're seeing, it carries this sense of like, you know, we don't really want you here. But if you're going to be here, then you have to be here on our terms and you have to be grateful for it. And sometimes I think that, you know, and first of all, I think that's kind of representative of how a lot of people of color in Britain feel. The country is generally saying to them. But, you know, sometimes I think that people actually need a big dose of what they think they want. You know, what if all those players of color went on strike? You know, withdraw their labor, have your all white team who, you know, don't bring up these challenging things for you. And let's see how that goes. You know, I often say that, like, without recognition of the empire, the very English cup of tea is just a cup of milk and hot water. And, you know, who wants to drink that?
Yeah, I don't want to drink that. I mean, I suppose one thing that I don't think Gareth Southgate is acting cynically here, but I mean, one thing his statement does mean is that, you know, I suppose you could imagine a different manager would have allowed a division to be generated within the England football team between players of colour and white players. And then you have a situation where, you know, at the extreme, like you're saying, you do have players of colour who are saying, like, we're not going to be part of this. And what Gareth Southgate has done very effectively is say, look, we are all one team. We are acting as one people. Yes, the taking the knee probably means something more to the players of colour, but everyone in the whole squad has agreed we will be taking the knee at the start of matches. If you've got a problem, take it up with all of us as a whole. And I think, you know, that's what's so powerful about what he's done there. And it does make me, you know, even more positive. I'm not a massive football fan, but I do watch the international ones, and it does. I think it bodes well for Euro 2020, which is taking place in 2021. Dalia, Gebrial, it has been a wonderful evening spent with you.
Thank you. It's been wonderful spending the evening with you too.
I might go and catch the final 20 minutes of sunlight. Thank you so much for watching tonight's show. We'll be back on Friday. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.